the next thing we're going to do is set up OpenStack networking services. So we're doing a three-tier network setup. Instead of using legacy network, we're going to use OpenStack networking Neutron. So what we need to do first is on the controller node, let's go ahead and get this password into our paste buffer. We're using this for everything. And let's say MySQL, MySU root, MySP. We're going to connect to the MySQL database. And the first thing we want to do is create a database called Neutron. Then what we need to do is grant all privileges on Neutron, all tables, to Neutron at localhost, identified by this particular password. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is rerun that command, but instead of localhost, it's going to be the %, which is the wildcard host. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is, okay, so now we exit that, and the next thing we're going to do is create a user for the Neutron user with Keystone. So Keystone user create, name of Neutron, pass that, email Neutron at wave.net. And again, that doesn't exist. Oh, we forgot to run the, actually, the source admin OpenRC. Whenever we get this error message, it usually means that we haven't run the admin OpenRC. We haven't sourced it, rather. Okay, so now we've gone ahead and created the user. Now we want to do Keystone user role add. The user is Neutron. The tenant is, of course, service. And this has the role of being an admin. Okay, so now we've created the user in Keystone, so now we need to create the service. Keystone service create, and service called Neutron. And the type of the service is network. And the description is OpenStack networking. Okay, now we need to create the endpoint. One of the things we need to do is take a look at the service and get the actual service ID. So let's Control-C out of this. I'm going to do Keystone service list. And we want to actually get a copy of this particular ID. This is for Neutron networking. That is the service ID. Let's copy that to our paste buffer. Okay, so let's go Keystone endpoint create service ID of that public URL http://controller 9696, and what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and copy, actually let's just type it, it's short enough, and that's admin URL and internal URL. Okay, now we've gone ahead and created the endpoint. Now we need to install the networking components. So we do yum-y install OpenStack Neutron, OpenStack Neutron ML2, which is a part of part of the switch for a modular layer 2, and of course layer 2 is Ethernet for other protocols at the data link layer. And then we want to install Python Neutron client, which we may have already installed, but let's go ahead and run that explicitly. And let's see how long this is going to take. Second install. A couple more minutes than that. So now we need to create an alias. And we've done this before, but first we create an alias called OC. And then we're going to set one up called OCS, which is OpenStack config set to OC set. And then we're going to create one called alias OCSN to OCS EPC neutron.conf. So now we've got an alias we can run, and what that does is it'll actually run the commands. It'll make it a little bit less typing for us in this. So the first thing we want to do is replace the we want to configure networking to use the database. So let's say OCSN database connection MySQL neutron Okay. The next thing we want to do is set up the networking identity service to use identity service. So OCSN default auth strategy keystone. So now let's create another alias, alias OCSNK equals OCSN keystone auth token. And now we're going to run a series of commands that actually set up the neutron.conf. So let's say OCSNK auth strategy. Oh, we have to do that. OCSNK auth URI http://controller 5000. Next, we're going to set the auth host controller. Next, we're going to set the auth protocol to HTTP. Next, we're going to set the auth port to 35357. Next, we're going to set the tenant name, the admin tenant name to service. Next we're going to set the admin user to neutron. And then next we're going to set the admin password to our neutron password. And so the next thing we're going to set is OCSN, which of course runs this default. So let's go ahead and say OCSN default RPC underscore backend neutron OpenStack RPC IMPL QPID. And then the next thing we're going to run is OCSN default QPID underscore hostname controller. Now we need to, okay, so we've gone ahead and set it up to use the message broker. Now we need to configure networking to tell the compute that we just changed the network topology. So let's say OCSN default notify Nova on port status change true. Next in default we want to say notify Nova on port data changes true. I noticed a typo, so let's go back and change this to port status. Change to port status changes. Okay. Okay, now OCSN default Nova URL http://controller 8774 OCSN default. Again, that's OpenStack config set nova.conf. That's what that stands for. And that's just an alias that we've explicitly created. So next is Nova URL. Okay, so next is Nova admin username. Okay, that's good. Now, the next command, we're going to actually have to figure out the ID of the tenant ID. So let's say keystone tenant list. And we want to get the ID, the tenant ID for service. So let's go ahead and copy that. And now we want to say OCSN default Nova admin tenant ID that okay, now we want to say OCSN default Nova admin password and our Nova pass. Next, we want to say OCSN default Nova admin auth URL to this one. v2.0. And the next thing we want to do is configure networking to use the modular layer 2. So OCSN default for underscore plugin ML2. The next thing we want to say service plugins router. Okay, so now we want to configure the modular layer 2 plugin. So let's go ahead, and this uses part of Open vSwitch mechanism, and that's part of the agent that builds a virtual networking framework for the instances so that they're all talking to each other on a private network. So the first thing we want to do is create another alias. Let's take a look at our aliases. So alias, this is going to be called ML2. Okay, so this is a slightly different location of the config files under etc neutron plugins ml2 underscore conf.ini. Because it's a plugin, it's going to have a slightly different config file format because that is at the decision of the plugin author. So let's go ahead and create. We have an alias that's based on, let's call it OCSM, and that's going to be OCS etc neutron plugins ml2 underscore conf.ini. Okay, so now what we need to do is type OCSM ML2 type drivers GRE. Okay, OCSM ML2 tenant network types GRE. OCSM ML2 mechanism underscore drivers open vSwitch. Okay, now we've set up that, so now we need to set some tunnel ID ranges. So OCSM ML2, and this is for the private tunnels. So let's say OCSM ML2 underscore type underscore GRE. These are GRE tunnels. So tunnel ID ranges 1.1000. Next we want to set, let's take another look at this. OCSM, we've set the type GRE, so now we need to set security group firewall driver to neutron dot agent dot linux dot iptables underscore firewall dot OVS hybrid IP tables firewall driver. Next we want to run OCSM security group enable security group true. Okay, so now we need to tell compute to use networking. We've already connected networking to use the identity service, so now we need to use compute to use networking, and then we've connected all that together. So we need to, again, make sure that we have the neutron pass in our haste buffer. And we're going to remember, if you remember, we've got this OCSN command, this one, that sets the neutron.conf. Well, we're going to reassign that, because next we've got to set up Nova. Actually, we're going to create another one, alias OCS Nova equals OCS etc nova.conf. And so now we're going to say OCS Nova default network underscore API underscore class nova.network.neutron v2.api.api. Next we want to set default neutron underscore URL to HTTP controller 9696. Then we want to set the neutron auth strategy to keystone. Next we want to set the neutron admin tenant name to service. Next we want to set the neutron admin username to neutron. Next we want to set the neutron admin password to our neutron pass. Next we want to set our neutron admin auth URL to http://controller 135.357 v2.0. Next we want to set the default Linux net underscore interface underscore driver to nova.network.linux underscore net to .linux ODS interface driver. I'm going to set the T firewall underscore driver. Oh no, that's actually good. So we want to set the firewall driver to nova.vert.firewall no-op firewall driver. Next we want to set security underscore group API neutron. So compute uses its own firewall service, but what we're going to actually do is disable that because the networking has its own, and you can see that by the no-op firewall driver, which is what we've set for Nova. So let's take an actual look at what this file looks like. So let's just view it, etc nova.conf. And you can see that this has all been set up based on the commands that we took on the command line, or that we typed on the command line. What we can do is edit this file manually, and that's always an option. Okay, so now what we need to do is create a symbolic link that allows etc neutron plugin.ini to point to this plugins file. So ln -s plugins ml2 underscore conf.ini to etc neutron plugin.ini. Okay, so now let's go ahead and restart compute services for I in API scheduler conductor do service OpenStack Nova I restart. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start the networking service and configure it to start on system boot. So service neutron server start check config neutron server on. Okay, so one of the things we need to do, okay, so now that we've set all that, is we're going to configure the network node. So that was all done on the controller node. So let's go to the network node, and we need to edit the etc sysctl.conf, and this is for kernel configuration. So first we need to turn on IPv forwarding, IPv4 forwarding. So that's IP underscore forward. Let's set that to 1. And then the RP filter, turn that off. That's for the default route. Let's also create one for the all. So for default interface and for all interfaces. Okay. Actually, save that as an incorrect file name. Okay, so let's take another look at that because we created a junk file that we didn't mean to, and I went ahead and deleted that. Okay, that looks good. So let's implement those changes. sysctl-p. Okay. You can see we've turned on IP forwarding and we've turned off the RP filter, and looks like we're not accepting source routes. So now let's install OpenStack Neutron and ML2 Open vSwitch. This is again on the network node. -y install OpenStack Neutron, OpenStack Neutron ML2, OpenStack Neutron Open vSwitch. Okay, now we're on the network node, and let's go ahead and we're going to run some OpenStack configs. So alias OC equals, at some point we're going to put these into a alias file, but at this point it's not necessary. So there we go. Okay, alias OCSN is going to be OC-set etc neutron.conf. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to set up the networking common component configuration for authentication, message broker, and the plugin for ML2, which is the layer 2 connectivity. So the first thing we're going to do is OCSN default auth strategy keystone. And that again is in the default. Okay, so now let's create another alias, OCSNK, and that's OCSN keystone underscore auth token. Okay, so now OCSNK, we're going to set the authorization URI to http://controller 5000. Next, we're going to set the auth host to controller. Next, we're going to set the auth protocol to HTTP. Next, we're going to set the port to 35357. Next, we're going to set the admin tenant name to service. Next, we're going to set the admin user to neutron. Then we're going to set the admin password to this one. Okay, so now we're going to set it up to use the message broker. So that's OCSNK, that's OpenStack config set neutron. Actually, it's just OCSN because we're not doing anything with related to keystone auth token. So OCSN default RPC underscore backend neutron.openstack.common.rpc.impl qpid, and then we're going to set qpid underscore hostname to controller. Next, we're going to set the core plugin mel2. And we're going to add the service plugins router. Okay, so now we've gone ahead and created that. The other thing we can do is we're going to configure something called the Layer 3 agent, which is for instances for virtual networks. So there's another file called neutron l3_agent.ini. So let's create another alias for editing that file. So alias OCSL is OC set etc neutron l3_agent.ini. And the next thing we're going to do is set the interface driver. We need to configure that. So let's go ahead and do OCSL default interface underscore driver. One of the things that's really frustrating about OpenStack is that the config file formats, there's all kinds of different ways that things are represented in fields and stuff. It's not extremely consistent, but if you follow the directions, it works pretty well. So we're going to set the interface driver to neutron agent Linux interface OVS interface driver. OCSL default use namespaces true. One of the things that's also particularly frustrating is the mixed use of singular and plural. So this reads core plugin and this reads service plugins, and that's another thing that you have to pay close attention to when doing configuration. So now the next thing that's really cool, and this is the DHCP agent, and this is something that we are going to set up according to what address range we want to use. So this is for the instance virtual networks. So let's create an alias. OCSD, OC set etc neutron DHCP underscore agent dot ini. Okay, so now OCSD default interface underscore driver neutron agent Linux interface OVS interface driver. Okay, now we need to set DHCP underscore driver to neutron agent Linux DHCP DNS mask. And what that does is a DNS masquerading. And that's precisely what we want. It's like a DNS proxy. So default use namespaces true. Okay, the next thing we want to create, we're going to configure is the metadata agent. So let's create another alias. This is for a file called etc neutron metadata underscore agent. One of the things that I'm going to do actually is produce an RPM that includes a bunch of scripts that take these steps, all these different configuration files, and create these aliases. So you'll be able to install my RPM and it will create a whole bunch of shortcuts. And it'll make it much easier to configure OpenStack. So that's something that's going to be available for free on the ThoughtWave site. So, okay, so now namespaces are set up, and the next step is it's called the metadata agent, and it provides configuration and credentials for remote access to instances. So let's create, okay, so we've created this alias, OCSM. So let's go ahead and run that. Default, and our authorization URL. One of the things that also bugs me is the inconsistency between the use of URL and URI. A URL is a uniform resource locator, and a URI is a uniform resource identifier. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so now we've created the auth URL. Let's set up an authorization region, and we're going to give it a name of region 1. So let's go ahead and set that. And then we're going to set up the admin tenant name service. The admin user, neutron. The admin password. And then we're going to set up the Nova metadata IP of controller. This can be an IP address, but it's better to put the host name. And the next thing is the metadata proxy shared secret. And we're going to use the same stupid password that we've been using for everything, just for simplicity. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go back to the controller node. And we have to use the same thing to set up the metadata proxy. So we're going back to the controller node, and let's take a look at our alias. We're going to edit the Nova file. So, okay, so that's OCS Nova, and we're going to simplify these and make them more consistent. So let's use OCS Nova default service neutron metadata proxy true. The next thing is neutron metadata proxy shared secret. Let's go ahead and set it to that. Now we need to go ahead and restart the compute API service. So service OpenStack Nova API restart. In the next section, we're going to go ahead and configure the ML2 plugin, which is the Modular Layer 2 plugin. And on the guide, this is page 55.